What's a piece of information that you learned that feels illegal to know?
You should have never picked a fight with me!
Balance has come to claim the unbalanced. A misstep for them.
Cut. That doesn't actually tell us anything. I mean, just look at that buff bar. There are 2 red pots, there's a fire giant buff, there's a purple buff, and then you also used Frenzy and Thunder. Really, that's not telling us anything. That could be a Capri doing the same thing. Let's try that again.
The day of reckoning is upon you!
Your belief in magic is misplaced. Spirits added to the pool of balance.
Today we're doing some very fun stuff with Fafnir. Credit to this idea goes to Flairboot, who was the one who posted it on Twitter, saying that Fafnir's Dragon's Breath is affected by attack speed. This is a little bit weird because if you read the ability's description, it says the ability is supposed to hit 3 times per second. So I thought it was odd that Flair was posting this bug publicly instead of just reporting it to Hi-Rez. But then I found out that he actually had reported to Hi-Rez already and had gotten the response that this is in fact intended. And it's rather the tooltip here that is just not quite up to date. So you're supposed to be able to use attack speed on Fafnir's Dragon's Breath, and what you just saw is the result of that. Now, this is a very, very complicated thing, I would say, because it's not something that is easy to execute, because you first of all need to get to the point of the game where you have a build that can support that, and then secondary to that, you also need to be able to get that damage off. So today we're first going to talk a little bit about the build and then about my in-game experience. This was supposed to be a partial gameplay commentary, but unfortunately that won't be the case because Hi-Rez decided to reset my audio with this patch once again. But that's okay, we'll still have a look at some parts of the game. The first thing I want to find out is how much damage this build is even capable of and if it's best to build full attack speed. The answer to the full attack speed part is no. While Fafnir's Dragon's Breath doesn't exactly scale insanely high with 10% scaling per tick, having some power still wins over blindly building attack speed. And even more importantly, other ways to amplify damage. You want to have some penetration in order to be able to deal more damage with everything you do, especially if the enemy has some defenses as well. And then you want to have some extra damage amplifiers too. The first build I tried that worked decently was Gem of Focus, Shogun's Kusari, Toxic Blade, Demonic Grip, War of Tahuti, as well as Karen's Coin. Now the problem is that certain effects here don't work, and this will always be the case no matter how we're building this, because during his Fire Breath he cannot proc item effects with that. I'm not even sure if that would work for War of Tahuti, but what I realized anyways is that the extra power from War of Tahuti doesn't really do that much. It is just very high power, but that's not the best way to amplify the Dragon's Breath. Also, while Demonic Grip is one of the items that provides some of the highest attack speed, it isn't particularly useful in that you can't proc the passive in the dragon form, and it doesn't really come with any other additional stats. So I figured while Ring of Hecate technically has slightly lower attack speed, it still provides more useful stats here because it also has 15% magical lifesteal, which works well with having some other slightly tanky items to give us a little bit more sustain. Flairboot suggested swapping out Gem of Focus for Spear of the Magus. The downside is that that only works on one target, and I figured I kind of have both. So after trying that out and the result only being a little bit better, I swapped out War of Tahuti instead, and that was a really good result. So these are the items I ended up with. Spear of the Magus, Shogun's Kusari, Toxic Blade, Karen's Coin, Gem of Focus, and Ring of Hecate. What is interesting is that with the exception of Spear of the Magus, every item in this build actually provides some form of survivability. Shogun's Kusari comes with a little bit of magical defense, Toxic Blade with a little bit of health, Karen's Coin with a little bit of movement which can help as well as obviously HP 5, and Gem of Focus comes with a damage reduction, while Ring of Hecate has some lifesteal. So you are not tanky, but you get a little bit of defense, and then we have to keep in mind that Fafnir also has a passive, and that passive provides him with additional defense. You can get up to 25 physical and magical protection through the passive. That means you are still hovering around 100 something protections each with Shogun's Kusari, which is making you a bit more of a bruiser than you would typically see in a damage focused build. And while this build is brutal, when I plugged it into SDPS by AntD97, the DPS values were most certainly not those of a bruiser. With all the buffs from before included, he'd end up around 1550 DPS against a level 20 Odin bot. But even without the buffs, his DPS still peaked around 1000 and hovered around 900 something. So those were some fat numbers that I wanted to see in action. In order to do that, I had to answer an important question. How do I solve the build order? Because obviously, this is not something that would go well at the start of the game no matter what I do. So I figured I'd need some power as well as some MP5 first in order to get my clear going, especially with the 1, and then be able to use a lot of MP5 as well in order to use my 2 for heals to survive the laning phase, no matter where I'd play it. So I started with Conde Gem as well as the tier 1 of Current's Coin. That way I would have enough MP5 and then would get Current's Coin relatively early, which would allow me to have sufficient clear and also allow me to start stacking this early to get the extra movement speed. Next, I actually went into Toxic Blade. Now, I think this was not the best move. I figured I could maybe get away with it because I would have some movement speed from Current's Coin over time and then I'd have some movement speed from that. The item also provides some pen. While we can't really use the passive well, everything else about it is just nice for the ultimate. That is something that I also did because I wasn't really sure if the enemy team was going to surrender early or something in multiple games. So I wanted to make sure I have at least some usable footage with some attack speed and not just build power early on and then make a video about power Fafnir. That actually didn't end up being a concern, but if you're not pressed on time and you just want to try around until you find the perfect way to do it, then I would suggest going cooldown boots instead. Because one big problem that this build has is that cooldown is very hard to get and you are only really strong in the dragon form. After that, I figured I'd do it depending on the matchup. Either I'd go Shogun's Kusari if the mid laner is very oppressive, or if I was in a position where I could play up a little bit more or set up for teammates as well, I would go Spear of the Magus. Then after that, I would make the decision between Shogun's Kusari or Ring of Hecate. Then I'd probably hit level 20 and build Gem of Focus, and then build whichever I didn't build before. I actually ended up building Hastened Ring in one of the games first because I figured I might as well stick to enemies because they had 4 physicals and only 1 magical, but I actually still ended up swapping it over to Shogun's Kusari because I felt just having that little bit of magical defense, even if it's just against 1 enemy, is great. Obviously that was a terrible matchup and I would have been much better off in a different situation where there are 2 magicals or maybe even 3, where you really get value out of that Shogun's Kusari. I wasn't quite sure which lane I was going to go into and I ended up with mid. I think the problem would have been in solo lane if I was running against a physical, then I would have had a very rough time early in the game, and in ADC, which also would seem like something you could build them, I'd struggle with the very limited sustain and I'd probably get poked out of lane constantly because the ADC would eventually be building crit, and it's also not fun to play, so I figured mid is probably the better place to do it. Jungle or support wasn't really an option since I needed Gem of Focus, and here it's worth pointing out again as well that Animosity would not proc on this. What I realized in mid in both games is that Fafnir's clear is actually not too terrible. Obviously it is not as good as that of a mage, no doubt about that, but you can kind of get away with throwing a 1 into the wave most of the time and just playing back a little bit and eventually using a 3 to clear up the rest. It can still get risky, you can still get ganked very easily, especially if you use your 3, and you can still get poked a lot, but if you have some MP5 going, then you can heal up quite often as well, and if you get ganked really hard, you can also just use your ult for safety. So you mostly sit relatively passively through the early game, but if you have a jungler that plays off your CC well, then you can also use your 1 to just stun the enemy while they think you're clearing, and then set up some ganks that way. Because the build mostly starts with damage increases and pen, you actually do decent amounts of damage with your abilities around mid-game. It's still not oppressive or anything, but it could be worse. But obviously what we really want to know about, especially if you're not looking to play it in Conquest but rather in something like Arena where you get to the late game stage quicker, is how this performs in late game. Now, the first thing I'll say here is if you actually get your damage off on a target, if you get your CC off and you've got your 2 activated and you get your basic attacks on a target, this is ridiculous damage and it'll shred even through tankier targets quite quickly. It's definitely super fun to play and it's super satisfying to get kills with it. At the same time, playing this build is incredibly intense in my opinion. Your positioning has to be on point at all times, you have to be super map aware, you have to very strategically avoid CC, and ideally you want to follow up on your team's CC. The problem for me was that our team was not exactly a CC heavy team in general, with an Apuash support and an Osiris solo, as well as a Naja who obviously is better at single target damage, but doesn't really require my follow-up because usually we pick out a target and that target was probably dead afterwards. That meant that most of the time I'd be relying on my own CC and follow-up. At the same time, the enemy team comp also made things harder. They had a Tiamat who can go into relatively heavy defenses and then I can't burn through her as quickly. They had a Fenrir support who could go on me very aggressively and punish me hard while I couldn't deal much damage to him either. And most importantly, they had a Varman who was building a health-focused build with animosity. That's something that can be countered very well by various item effects, but if you're relying on your raw damage because your Dragonfire doesn't use those item effects, that is a bit of a problem. Even if I got Sunder instead of Frenzy for the Varman, which would have been the smarter choice, I still would have not been able to lock him down with his ultimate at all. So most of the time I was really limited to 2 targets who didn't make themselves exactly available and who also had a great amount of damage to respond to whatever I did. And what I realized very quickly was jumping into the middle of a team fight against a team that is roughly aware that you're not exactly tanky Fafnir paints a massive target on your back. Now, as I said, you do get some extra defenses from the passive and from Shoguns, but they're not enough when the team decides to turn on you. So taking large amounts of damage was definitely what I struggled with the most, and I think if you want to play this, it's ideal to have something like a gap support along with it that can allow you to get your damage off and also set up some CC. I will say that both for lane clearing as well as later fights, it was great that the cooldowns on both Fafnir's 1 and 3 are reduced now. That made things a fair bit easier than they otherwise would have been. And I really needed that because damage Fafnir really shows you some weak spots of the character. Obviously he has 2 relatively hard to hit abilities, being the Cone of the 3 as well as the 1, and you want to confirm both in order to really get those damage spikes, because otherwise you lose a lot of that. And then in addition to that, the 2 is super annoying to use because you always have to self-target, which means you have to aim down first in order to hit yourself with the ability and then use it. If you don't, you lose a ton of damage in your ultimate. This really made me wish that there was a hotkey for self-casting in Smite that would allow you to instantly use an ability on yourself. I know other MOBAs have that. That would actually be very practical in a game like this where you're constantly self-casting the ability. So in many ways, this was definitely a fun and interesting learning experience. Do I think it's overpowered? No, definitely not. It needs a lot of setup, a lot of things going your way, and ideally a team comp that's built around playing this. So there's a lot of ways this can be punished, and while it's very high damage, many gods in Smite can do high damage in some ways and not be overpowered. Do I think it's fun? Absolutely. You have to be ready for a very intense game where you have to be super aware of everything that's going on. But it is super fun to play, and if you run into a team comp that happens to have a little bit more magical damage, then you'll also feel a little bit tankier. Unfortunately, there isn't really much room for counter building because you can only really swap out the relics and make some minor build adjustments, but overall you need most of this in order to get enough damage out of the build. As a non-conquest build, I think it's absolutely hilarious. And what I again find unfortunate that I've talked about multiple times is that there is no physical defense item with attack speed. That would make this build a lot more flexible if you had an equivalent to Shogun's Kusari that could be used against physical characters, because then you could even goof around with it in something like Duel. If you're planning to build it, I would recommend doing so with some friends, because it might take you a few tries to do it and you don't want to tilt all the randoms you're playing with. If you want to see the end of the game stats as well, my damage was second on the team. I was not able to keep up with the mystical male Osiris, but overall the damage output was decent, the tankiness not so much. A lot of damage taken with very limited response. Again, it was made harder by the fact that there were 4 physicals, but even without that, I think it would have still been a lot. And with that, I put this hilarious experience to rest for now. Thanks to Flairwood for pointing this out once again. And if you want to see more goofy stuff like this, or more serious builds like the one that we're talking about in the next days, then click like and subscribe, or I will go to my garage, hide in the corner, stare at my home gym and contemplate if it's harder for me to find the time to work out, or for you to find. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That is That Nick Walker, Drain Brennan, Lanta25 Green, Zillaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, Angel, Zifaroli, and everyone else you see here.